Hey, I want to share my thoughts on the Jeffrey Epstein Filthy Rich documentary. So I recently watched this and I had to get myself in a place where I could watch something like this because the content is heavy and these are real people, and I wanted to make sure that I was in a place that I could respect what the victims had gone through. And so it took me, several weeks after it came out before I was ready to watch it. Uh, I will say the documentary was done very well. They walked the line between providing a voice for the victims, factual information, and then also creating it in such a way that it was very watchable. So you can present factual information, but if you do it in a very dry way, not very many people are going to watch it. And because the documentary was very well made, lots of people got to hear the voice of the victims in this, and I think that that is a tremendous service to the victims in this case. Victims who usually in life already, before they were harmed by Jeffrey Epstein, many of them came from poverty, came from existing trauma in their lives, came from a place of just being dismissed and throughout like their lives in society, and so I was really glad to see them in this documentary have their voice heard. I thought, and I was grateful to hear their voice. After I watched this documentary, then I listened to a podcast, the Armchair Expert, and the guest on there was a lawyer that represented many of the victims. I think his name was Bradley Edwards, and that was a really eye-opening podcast and or interview with this lawyer. First and foremost, I would just say that Jeffrey Epstein moved money before he died. Like, he took all his money and assets and put it in an account in the Virgin Islands, I believe. And the documentary kind of suggested that maybe, or sorry, not the documentary, but somebody who was interviewed suggested that they thought maybe that was because he didn't want any of the victims to get any money from him. But the lawyer said that that's not how things work. So that wasn't the case. That wasn't why he did that, because it's just not how things work. So the victims can still, get money. And so anyway, I just thought that was interesting, and I was glad to know that, because I certainly don't want to sensationalize anything, because I think the truth speaks for itself, and I don't want to poison the voice of the victims here by inserting anything that's not truthful. On the podcast, one of the things that was said that I wanted to talk about was that the income disparity was the issue, because Jeffrey Epstein was so rich, filthy rich, if you will, and many of the victims were not. Like, they were looking so that because the victims were in poverty, that's why this happened to them. And I think that can be a one of the causes involved, but I don't think it's a root issue. I think that's superficial. I think we have to look underneath. First of all, there are people like Jeffrey Epstein who are not rich that harm people. So being rich might make it easier for you to do, allow you to do it on a broader mass scale. There's things like that. But there are people in poverty conditions, people who don't have all this fancy stuff, people that harm others too. So, there are poor people that do awful things. So just like there are rich people, and there are rich people who do good things, and poor people do good things. So I don't think that money is the deciding factor here. I also don't think money is the deciding factor for the women. I think many of the victims felt alone, had nowhere else to turn. It was these things, because you can be poor, but if you feel like you have places to turn, if you feel like when things get, when you need help, you can get help, then I don't think you turn to something like this. And many of these women, I feel like they didn't have the parents, they didn't have the just broader community. They didn't have a place to turn, or they thought that they didn't have a place to turn. So I think a bigger issue is the coping mechanisms to deal with trauma, depression, like these things that happen in somebody's lives. To just simply say it was an income disparity, I think is a gross oversimplification. Something the lawyer said is that he had meetings one-on-one with Jeffrey Epstein because he requested to meet like that. And so throughout the documentary, it was mentioned that he was a master manipulator, and the lawyer like agreed, oh, he was. So he would say things like, be talking to you and be like, yeah, don't you think? And so that's a way you can lead somebody along, especially if you have maybe a lot of confidence in the way that you talk. The other person can be in your presence and be like, oh, this person is really intelligent, or they know, and yeah, I should agree with them. So don't you think? Like, to lead you into the way that they want you to think about something. So I thought that was very interesting. And it's something to be very aware of in our own lives when you meet somebody who is manipulative. I will also say this, I know people in my life who are manipulative, but they don't know that they are. So it's a way of life that they've learned, and it's just like what they do. So not everybody knows when they're being manipulative. In Jeffrey Epstein's case, I mean, obviously he was using tactics to groom and recruit and control and do all this. It definitely, well, I don't know. I'll let somebody else study the minds of people that seem like they might be sociopaths. But yeah, like I thought that was very interesting, and that when he sat down with them, one of the things that he said was like, oh, you know, I travel all over the world all the time, and this place, the legal age of consent is 17, and another place it's 18, and another place it's 16. Like, he was just, you know, who can keep track of these arbitrary age laws? And I thought that was interesting because he said arbitrary, and I was like, you know, he's not wrong. So it is arbitrary. And so I think it's important to identify when something is truth, but to dig a little deeper. The reason why in my opinion, the reason why we have laws is to protect broader truths. So sometimes the laws do seem arbitrary. So like you know, if the age of being adult is 18, well, yeah, that's somewhat arbitrary. We've taken some things into consideration for why that's chosen, but it's a little arbitrary. And so is the legal like age of consent can be arbitrary too. But what we're trying to do with these laws is protect a more vulnerable population, and that's children. And so that's the broader thing. And I think the even broader thing that we're trying to protect is that it's not okay to use somebody else against their will, to use them for your own pleasure against your will, like whatever that is. And I think that exists. I don't care if you're, you know, 15 or 25. I think that broader truth still exists, and that existed within this case, right? Because Jeffrey Epstein, yes, assaulted, raped young girls that were children, but he also did this same kind of thing in the documentary, there was somebody who was 22. Now, are we saying, well, it was just okay? And she didn't feel that it was just okay. She felt like she was put in a position where somebody who was stronger than her in some way, or was able to manipulate her, was able to control her. Like, what we're saying is that, like, it's not okay to do that. That's the broader thing. So Jeffrey Epstein can say something like, you know, these laws are arbitrary, but the reason why we have them in place is to try to protect vulnerable populations. I just thought it was interesting that he brought it up. He tried to bring it up of like, oh, like, try to be like, the person he's talking to will just be flummoxed or dumbfounded because like, oh, well, what do I say to that? Well, I can think of lots of laws that seem somewhat arbitrary to me, but they're there to protect a deeper truth. There was one more thing that was said in this podcast that I kind of just was like, no, like, put the brakes on this. We can't do this. And they brought up how some of the girls like were assaulted, but then they became recruiters of other girls, and the guilt that they carried. And it was plainly like visible in the documentary, speaking with some of these girls, that that guilt was especially Like, not only were they dealing with the pain and trauma, but also the guilt of what they were what they had done to helped to be done to other girls. And what was said in the podcast was, it's impossible to relieve guilt of bringing in more girls. It was, I'm paraphrasing, but it was something along those lines. And I just wanted to put out into the world, there is always redemption. No matter what has been done. You might have to deal with the repercussions of what was done. But there is always redemption for your heart, your soul, for who you are. There always is. So these girls that were involved in this and that recruited other girls, there is, like, amends can be made. There is redemption. You will not be under the burden of this guilt for the rest of your lives. There is healing. There is a way out. And I guess I just felt really strongly about that. I would never want the victims of Jeffrey Epstein to feel like that there won't be healing for themselves, because that would be a miserable, miserable existence. And it's not true. There is healing. That's just some thoughts that I had on it. It's definitely, I think, worthwhile to hear the voice of the victims and to watch this. So, yeah.